All right, my name is Norman Daniels. I'm the coordinator for Multicultural Affairs, and I will be the moderator for today's program. Today's program is entitled National Dialogue on Race Day. Panel discussion, Trayvon Martin, From Victim to Criminal. And what we're going to do, we're going to look at that particular case, but in actuality, you can't look at it as an isolated incident. So what we're going to do is looking at what happened 50 years ago on August 28th. Can anyone tell me what happened 50 years ago on August 28th? Not all at once. Say it again. Okay, the March on Washington, and that's where everyone heard Dr. King, share his dream with everyone. And in his dream, he's talking about having this basically a multicultural society. And the question today is, since that dream, have the dream been realized, or is it a dream deferred? So we're going to talk about that. And when we talk about Trayvon Martin, also we're going to look at what does it mean for young men, young black men in particular, where there's a pipeline from underachieving schools to overcrowded jails, and why is that? We need to see what kind of atmosphere that would lead to something like that. So what we're going to do today, we have 4 outstanding speakers, and I'm going to introduce them to you. First up, we call him our native Long Islander, and he's a brother from in the house here. Mark Fillens, let's give him a round of applause. And just to give you quick information about Dr. Fillens, he received his BA in philosophy from Stony Brook and a PhD from Penn State. He's the author of several articles on ethics and aesthetics. His book, Moral Menagerie, was published in 2007. He's been a professor of philosophy here at the college since 2004. Formerly the academic chair of the Department of Arts and Humanities, he's currently the chair of the Academic Assembly at the Grant campus. Let's give him another round of applause. It's always important when you have a discussion that you have different viewpoints. And I think today we're going to probably need I call it a psychological perspective. And the reason for it, I think, before we can grow in certain situations, we must heal. And I'm hoping today that the healing process that we have in this society can commence here at the Grant campus. So our next panelist is Dr. Stanford Griffith. Please give him a round of applause and come on up. Now, Dr. Griffith holds a doctoral degree in clinical psychology and has practiced both institutionally and independently in the Queens area of New York for over 30 years. He is an assistant clinical professor at Mount Sinai School of Medicine and was formerly on the faculty at St. John's University postgraduate in family and marital therapy. He's a native New Yorker, a Vietnam-era vet, and former New York City police officer. He's married to Dr. Canson Griffith and has been he's been most proud of his 3 children and the grandfather of 2. Given the above, Dr. Griffith proudly identifies himself as a brother from the community. Let's give him another round of applause. Okay, the next person, some of us old school folks will know him quite well. It's like a family member coming back home. Years ago, he was a commencement speaker here at the college, so it was great to have him back. Our next person is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. He's a former editor and columnist for Newsday. He was responsible for national, foreign, and health and science news, and he was at the paper for over a quarter of a century. He's the author, editor, and social critic who was delivered the prestigious L. Maitland Lecture at the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore. He lectures frequently about social and political issues, the future of journalism, African art, and liberation movements. He has 4 honorary PhD degrees from very prestigious university. His bio is so long that I'm going to try to cut it a little short, which I'm sorry, Les. But he was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, graduated with honors from the University of Connecticut. He has BA in English. He and his wife, Violet, they reside in Huntington and in Harlem, New York. Let's give a round of applause for Les Payne, journalist. And Mr. Payne's job is to kind of talk about journalistic integrity in terms of what is the responsibility of that media to tell us the truth. Next on our panel, another brother from in the house. Professor Williams holds the title of Assistant Professor Adjunct, has been teaching at Suffolk County Community College in the Criminal Justice Program since 2002. He also works with Suffolk County Police Department Recruitment Unit, has served as coordinator in criminal investigations, served as coordinator of the Police Cadet Program, and for many years was the ranking African American officer. He's a graduate of St. John's University, School of Law, the FBI National Academy, a police management program, and he also maintains private practice. So if any of you need a lawyer, you better try to get the hookup. Let's show some welcome to Kenneth Williams, Professor Kenneth Williams. Okay. Now, before we start the program, even though time is not really on our side, what I want to ask everyone in the audience to do is to please stand. And the panelists. And what I want to do is take a moment to pay homage, pay respect to all of those heroes and sheroes, known and unknown, that have made it possible through their sacrifice for us to be here today. May that person be from the civil rights movement. May that person, was martyred yesterday in terms of 9/11. May it be your great uncle who bailed you out of jail and now you're here today. Any of that situation. So let's go a minute of silence, please, or a moment of silence. Thank you. Be seated. The program will go as follows. Each speaker will be given 5 minutes to give their take on the Trayvon Martin case and also the state that we are in right now as a society or as a nation. After the 5-minute period, then we will impose some questions. You, the students, will have the last part of the program. You will be part of the question and answer. So the first speaker that will come up and give us his 5 minutes of his analysis of the situation is Dr. Fullins. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here and be part of this event. As Professor Daniels said, one of the things he asked the panelists to think on and meditate on is the Trayvon Martin case. And aside just from the emotional appeal of the tragedy of the case and the loss of and waste of a young life, the case is really a fascinating one, not to reduce someone's death to an academic exercise, but the case has sparked a lot of interest and response, not just from community activists and individual citizens, but also from scholars from a number of disciplines, including philosophers. And I think why the case is so urgent and appealing is that it really gives us the opportunity to kind of rethink some of our language and concepts about race and racism and how they operate today. When we asked the question, was racism a part of the Trayvon Martin killing? It seems very clear that race did play a part in what transpired. But when we use terms like racism, we need to be clear exactly what the word means. As a philosopher, one of the things I'm concerned with is language and concepts and what they mean and how we define them. If our only understanding of racism is a kind of Archie Bunker stereotype of someone who is overtly bigoted and uses hateful language, and we ask the question, well, was George Zimmerman a racist? Clearly, that becomes a complex thing to answer. And if that's our only conceptual framework, I don't think we can really understand what's going on in the Trayvon Martin case adequately. Was Zimmerman a racist? You know, there's some history of him not just singling out Mr. Martin, but making several 911 calls about persons of color in his community. On other accounts, however, he grew up in a multiracial environment, had in fact mentored young men of color very much like Mr. Martin. So it becomes almost a distraction to get into that question of whether Zimmerman himself was a racist or if his action was a racist action. Even if he was or wasn't, that doesn't exhaust the ways in which race can implicate itself into a situation like that. In his 911 call, Mr. Zimmerman used phrases like, he's a punk, this guy's up to something. Right? There is a long history that he and all of us inherit of making a link between criminality and blackness. Okay? Whether or not Zimmerman got up that morning and said, you know, I can't wait to hate on black people or not, he, like all of us, are affected by that history. And it's interesting that to note, and I think what's really important to focus on and reflect on in a case like this, is how that history can operate in us today at a very subtle, very pre-reflective kind of level. There's a famous psychology experiment from the 1940s in which the subjects were given a series of drawings and asked at a later time to recall the details of what they saw. And one of those drawings shows a white man confronting a black man with a knife. And the participants were asked to recall some of the details of that drawing at a later time, and guess what happens? Well, the knife magically moves from the white person's hand to the black person's hand. Are all the individuals who made that judgment overtly and consciously racist? Well, it doesn't have to be the case in order to explain something like that. At a very perceptual level, we already have these associations between a black man and a threat of some kind. What the Martin case asks us all to do is something along the lines of what the French philosopher Michel Foucault called an archaeology. We need to be perceptive of when those subtle attitudes, what seems natural and common sense, are sparking within us, are affecting how we perceive the world. Doing that kind of work to look at the history that went about making that connection between black males and criminality. That should not go unnoticed, and that should not go unreflected, even if we can find comfort in the fact that we don't use overtly racist language and we don't support overtly racist policies. We could still be victimized by that history and the way in which it filters into our understanding of things. I see Norm's giving me the hook. Just let me say that it's what's unthought and what's typically unspoken about our initial pre-reflective reactions to race and racism. That's what's really important. That, as the Martin case shows us, is what can be really, really dangerous. And that's what we all have a duty to attend to. And that's, I think, one of the valuable lessons of the Martin Zimmerman case.
Okay. Okay, as Dr. Fullens kind of touched on the subtleties from a psychological perspective, our next speaker will hit that topic like knocking a baseball out of the park. Dr. Griffith, it's your turn. Your 5.
All right. Well, let me throw a couple of balls and strikes first, Brother Daniels. First of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here, and an honor to be with such esteemed panelists, I must say. The timeliness of the forum is wonderful. However, could or should we be discussing the race issue anytime? And perhaps we need to think about that a little more, because probably we need to talk about it anytime. Yes, the murder of Trayvon Martin and the Zimmerman verdict brings the issue more acutely and emotionally to our consciousness. And perhaps the silver lining in this tragedy, and in my view, the travesty of justice, is the opportunity to think more deeply and talk about race. Thanks to Brother Daniels for bringing us together. And hopefully, again, this is not the only time that this happens. May not be us, but the issue, I think, needs to be uppermost, okay? Reactions to Trayvon, Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, Ramarley Graham, and a host of other murders of African ancestral people by those, especially those who have been charged with protecting their lives, has reverberated locally, nationally, and internationally. Yet, since the Zimmerman verdict, outrage, accountability, massive demonstrative action seems to be fading, is the expected complacency with shifting media focus on Syria and recent election events, taking this out of our consciousness, okay? Because there's a real kind of concern that we get hyped up about certain things, and somehow those things seem to dissipate the emotion that would lead us to maybe keep it on the table and take some action. 110 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem in the 20th century is the color line. Since Jim Crow, that line has been increasingly using invisible ink, except with Trayvon Martin and some of the more newsworthy situations that bring race to our real consciousness. People of African ancestry, especially in this country, are either consciously or unconsciously impacted by oppression, discrimination, just because of their color. The impact of dehumanization, devaluation, demonization, and of course, deculturation continued from the Middle Passage to the present day and plagued the psyche of African descendants. Residual or more overt horrific racial aggressions such as lynchings, beatings, and other atrocities commonly associated with slavery and Jim Crow continue to impact the mental and behavioral health of present-day African descendants. Those Africans who were forcibly taken from their homelands, separated from their families, forbidden to practice cultural and religious practices, and being forced to adopt to an alien culture, among other things, severely impacted on one's identity and orientation. Emerging identity problems, self-hatred, devaluing self and others who are similar, as well as identifying with the aggressor, are common outgrowths, often manifesting in displaced aggression, misdirected anger, and rage against one's own community of color. Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary brilliantly spells out this in her thesis on post-traumatic slave syndrome. Are people familiar with that? Okay, I would certainly reference that as something that might be very helpful to understand the impact over the years, the residual impacts of slavery. that still affect people of color. Historians, educators, psychologists, and others have documented the systematic assault on the African mind. Perhaps a bit more subtle today, except for the flagrant racially influenced killings and the response, and this is kind of interesting, I think, by many to the election of Barack Obama. The assault continues. Hopefully today we can engage more on the subtle assaults on African character and mind, especially how African descendants over time with repeated assaults have coped, internalized, and too often maladaptively reacted. Yes, we have to look internally, take responsibility, and address the necessary house cleaning. The village is fragmented and seemingly powerless. Trayvon's death and the verdict that followed can hopefully play a part in reconnecting the village. I have a few questions I have for the audience that I hope will provoke some thought and discussion. First, something I've always pondered, and I've asked this question a number of times and gotten a variety of different responses. But the question is, and it's particularly for those who identify as white, what is it like to be white? Think about it, okay? That's question number one. Do people who identify as white ever really give this a thought? If so, under what circumstances? Next question. If given a choice, what percentage of people who identified as African descent, if given the choice, would choose to be white? Would this percentage be different before, during, and after the 1960s? Next question. Why is the disease racism so pervasive and enduring? What's the benefit? What's the benefit of racism? Who benefits from that? Next question. What have Africans or African descendants done to warrant such treatment? And finally, if people of color were so-called in power, would they treat white people the way that white people have treated them? So hopefully these questions will generate a little bit of thought and hopefully response, because I think we need to look at that. I'll stop there.
Okay. Brother Payne.
Good morning or good afternoon, whichever it is. To Mr. Daniels, a fellow panelist, students, guests, I remember that Mr. Daniels said during the introduction that I had some time ago given the commencement address here, and I had a lot of fond memories. One of them is that I was booed. I was booed by one of the parents when I made an unkind remark about the sitting president of the United States, who at that time was Ronald Reagan, who shows you how long ago it was. But I'm used to getting booed. I was a columnist at Newsday for 25 years, and it has been recorded, if not in the Guinness Book of Record, at least in the history of Newsday, that I received more hate mail than any other columnist at the paper. And in fact, all the other columnists combined. And some of my hate mail used to be passed under the noses of the Suffolk County Police Department's bomb-sniffing dogs. I don't know how they would do that with email these days, but at any rate, maybe they just put the whole way. But anyway, it's good for me to be here. And we each have 5 minutes, and we said earlier that the person who takes off his watch is usually the person who runs overtime. I had taken mine off, so I put it back on because I don't want the hook. But here we go. So our role is, and you have a very distinguished panel here. I mean, you have a philosopher, and I'm impressed as a philosopher, a psychologist, and criminal justice expert, and I am a journalist, and we usually are the observers. And I'm not a scholar or a historian. We are the scouts for scholars. We're the people who can run ahead of the historians, and if we get it right, sometimes they get it right, and if we get it wrong, sometimes they still get it right, despite us. So there are a few points. There are 5 points that I want to leave very briefly on the record. So our role is to stake out our as they say in National Geographic, to set mark our territory for discussions. The first one I wanted to point out is that I think that I've lived on Long Island since the early 70s. We've raised children here. And one of the things that I noticed about Long Island is that it's a very good, Long Island where you are now, where we are now, where some of you were born and live, is a very good laboratory to talk about and to examine race relationships and the evolution of fairness in the society. And it is a good laboratory because Long Island, which began essentially, modern suburbia began in Levittown, roughly post-World War II, 1947. Mr. Levitt built Levittown and became known as the father of suburbia. And one of the things we noticed since we are looking at the long view is that back then in Levittown, African Americans were not allowed to live in Levittown legally. Could not live. There were covenants in the deeds. It says that African Americans could not live in Levittown in 1947. African Americans could not live in Levittown until the first African American didn't move into Levittown until 1963. And in fact, there was one white family that lived in Levittown that was thrown out because this family allowed their children to play with African American children who lived in one of the villages nearby. So this is a very good way to look at evolution, as things pass along. The other thing that I want to put on the agenda is that, again, I'm a journalist and I'd worked at Newsday for 38 years. And I remember there was a time when we had a editor who proposed doing a project on Long Island, and he said the project would be called Integration on Long Island. And I, at that point, had been living for about 10 years on Long Island. This is in the late 80s. So I said, and his name was Bob Green, very legendary investigative reporter, and he was going to do this long series. He had about 5 or 6 reporters. They're going to do this long series in Newsday on integration on Long Island. I said, Bob, if you were to proceed on this, this would be the shortest series in the history of journalism. There ain't no integration on Long Island anywhere. And he went ahead, he ignored me, and they went ahead and fielded a dozen reporters, and he proceeded to write this long series, what he initially conceived as being integration on Long Island, and they ended up calling it, and I'll show you, this long Newsday series in 1990 called Segregation on Long Island. Everywhere they looked, they found racism, deep racism, the racism of the type that was mentioned here philosophically, justified. It was verified by poll numbers, which we could get into if you're interested. So segregation on Long Island. This was in the 90s. Okay, but that was in the 90s. My third point is that what about now? What about criminal justice? What about in the wake of Trayvon Martin? I, for that, would like to leave on the record a report that was done, and again, I'm not going to read it to you by any chance, but it was done by the Justice Policy Institute. And what they looked at, and it's interesting, and what they looked at, it was the incarceration rates for drug offenses, the incarceration rates for drug offenses. And what they found is that the use, sale, and distribution of illegal drugs in America was at about this, between whites and black youth and non-youth was about the same. Among African Americans, it was like 9.3. Among whites, generally, it was 8.5. Roughly the same. It's a wash. The use, distribution, and sale was the same. But the incarceration rate was astoundingly different. In fact, nationally, it was 10 times greater. And what they did is they looked at 198 counties in America, which constituted 55% of the population of America. And they looked at these individual counties. In all of these counties except 2, they found that the rate of African-American incarceration for drug offenses, by the way, the same drug offenses that whites were committing, was, on the average nationally, was 10 times greater. And I'll throw some figures out at you. And for instance, in St. Louis, Missouri, the ratio was 7-to-1. In Somerset, New Jersey, it was 11-to-1. In New York City, it was 5-to-1. Now, let me ask you, what might you guess it would be in Nassau and Suffolk County? Do you understand what I'm saying? The incarceration rates of African American vis-a-vis whites committing the same drug offense. What do I mean by the same drug offense? I mean, the cop pull up to you, you roll your window down, he smells a whiff, right? You know what I mean? All right? And if you're African American in New York, you're 5 times more likely to be written up for that than if you are white. Now, what do you think it is on Long Island, in Nassau, Suffolk County? Please, just guess. Draw a figure out. It's nationally, it's 10 times. In New York City, it's 5 times. What do you think on Nassau and Suffolk County? Please. Yes. 8-to-1. Just draw a figure out. It's all right. You're not going to be graded on this. 20-to-1. 10-to-1. 15-to-1. 36-to-1.
Ooh.
Nassau and Suffolk, the same, 36-to-1. Now, when I saw that, it stunned me because I'm a parent of 3 children, 2 of them boys, and they all hung out with white friends. They went to Harbor Fields, which was, 97% white at that point, and all their friends were white. And yet, when they, though, if perchance either Jamal or Holly, my 2 boys, if they were in that car where the cop pulled up and they got a whiff of a joint, they are 36 times more likely to go to jail than a white. In Nassau County, and I raised them in Huntington. Stunning as a parent. Okay, now that certainly is a background. The other point that I would like to, and by the way, this is in a study, by the way. I'm not making these figures up. You can look at, and by the way, this figure was not done in the 1940s. It was done in 2007, which is not all that long ago as these studies go. Now, before, I don't want to leave you with too depressing a figure. I'm very optimistic about where things are going. People ask about where is it going. I'm optimistic for any number of reasons since Martin Luther King's march in 1963. For instance, back then, as was pointed out, there were 5 African-American congressmen in Congress, all of them men, of course. Now there are 43. There were no African-Americans in the Senate. Now there is 1 in the Senate. Back then, there were no African-American members of the Supreme Court. Now we have -1. Clarence Thomas, that's an in-group joke. I figure a few people would get it. So we have -1. So now, but in politics now, things have changed. In fact, the President of the United States is African-American, and I think that is a huge, monumental sea change. And what hope there is because your parents did not vote for him, by the way, and if you put guns to head, they wouldn't vote for him. But your generation voted for him. The people, your older brothers and cousins, white and black, voted for him. Therein is where the hope is. The baby boomers are gone. They would not, baby boomers in the election, and they proved it. In the election of 2008 and 2012, they would not vote for an African-American if he ran against an elk hound. In fact, Obama in 2008 ran against an elk hound, McCain. And in 2012, he ran against a man that no one likes. No whites like him. Not even Mormons like Romney. And yet, whites voted for him overwhelmingly. Why? You couldn't put a gun to that. For you, it will change, and I'm done.
Wow. Okay, our legal expert. Let's give Professor Williams a round of applause, some love.
Thank you.
And lawyer, 5 minutes.
Yes, I'm sure my students will tell you that I never run over, right? All right. Thanks for coming today, folks, and thanks to my colleagues who are taking time out of their schedules, class schedules, to be here. The 15 weeks are never enough, and I can appreciate your dedication to this subject and to your students for bringing them here. I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic than some of the other panelists on this subject. I will say, for example, that we should be in no celebratory mood as we have a dialogue on race. It's against the backdrop of failure and at a time when many people see a future of worsening scenarios, when things are not going to change much, if at all. The 50-year milestone of the March on Washington passed as a cruel reminder of a half-century of wasted time, meager effort, and squandered opportunity in our progress toward a multicultural democracy. Certainly not what Dr. King envisioned is where we are today. It's no coincidence that tough economic times make a lot of people believe that we're going to see renewed incidents of racial conflict. You see, when you talk race in America, you're largely talking economic class. The two are closely tied. The architect of the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin, originally wanted it to be a march for jobs and economic opportunity. That was put off quite effectively, and it wasn't until 20 years later that we saw a march for racial equality and economic equality. Again, it was a march for jobs and to some degree. It was only when the demand for racial justice, or at least the demand to end the atrocities that met the civil rights struggle, that resulted in a cauldron too big to be ignored. The country sort of had to allow a safety valve, something to appease a growing, not only growing frustration on the part of African Americans, but white Americans too, who had become fed up with the status quo. A large segment of the people of color in our country still live under the poverty line. According to the U.S. Census, a third of African Americans live under the poverty line, and 40% of African American children live at or below the poverty line. And don't forget, that line is established by a dollar figure that's not realistic, and certainly not too generous in large economic centers where many African Americans live. That concentration of African American population in cities was the result of a mass migration to large cities in the United States. And we are familiar with the economic downturn in those areas and the poor job prospects. By the way, there's a must-read book on this migration. The Warmth of Another Sun is the title. It would replace a large part of American history instruction if students just read that book. What a fabulous account of people's movement and the country's change at that time. Much of the job loss in these cities was the result of white flight to the suburbs and communities where economic barriers then and still keep us locked in a largely segregated society. Our separate but unequal societies make possible a situation that supports a school-to-prison crisis. It creates a climate for fear and distrust that brings about a Willie Horton situation or a Trayvon Martin case, and probably a more egregious case of the violation of civil rights and just an episode that flies in the face of justice was the Amadou Diallo case in 1995 in the Bronx. Because it involved supposedly agents that protect civil rights and protect an individual, they wound up taking the life of a young African immigrant, unarmed, who was shot 41 times. And that might be ancient history for some people here, but the legal ramifications associated with that case and the fact that those 4 officers involved were acquitted is tragic and is again, in my opinion, from my pessimistic view, another reason that a lot has to be done. Remember, in terms of Trayvon Martin, that he was the one indisputable fact from an incident when many of the facts are not available, is that he was not engaged in a crime. He was not planning to commit a crime. He had not committed a crime. He wasn't fleeing from a crime when he was approached by George Zimmerman. He wasn't planning to burglarize a house. He wasn't going to rob anyone. He wasn't going to rape a woman. He was a 17-year-old law-abiding citizen using a halftime break in a televised basketball game to get a snack from a store. That seems to be a fact that is dismissed because I can't reconcile this individual at that time and his intention and his actions being included in his death or leading up to his death. I can't imagine what Amadou Diallo was thinking when he's a guy who had done no crime and in his mind wasn't wanted by anyone for any unlawful act. I can't imagine what he was thinking as bullets riddled through his body at his door. Ask yourself, what causes a person to see a black teenager and assume that the teenager is committing a crime? What compels that person to grab a gun? What drives that person after he's assured by the police that officers are on their way to accost that black teenager? Fear, hate, reaction to a creature of our segregation, our biased news reporting, our outlandish stereotyping seen in motion pictures and entertainment? Is there a truly race-neutral setting? Are people deeply involved and concentrating in their mundane activities, temporarily oblivious to race and meaningless distinctions among us? The parents of preschoolers who are in the sandbox. Though we don't use sandboxes anymore, right? They're off limits. How about the middle school kids horsing around in the lunchroom? You've seen them, black, white, making up all kinds of ethnic mixtures. The office staff working toward a crucial deadline. People work together, get jobs done, happens every day, all day. But what happens to us when the playtime is over? The parents have to pick up the kids and take them home for dinner. What happens when the school bell rings and the school buses pull up and you begin to see the segregation based on bus routes, neighborhoods, and where the kids come from? What happens when the office factory whistle blows? People go home. They're segregated communities. Is that where we start the process all over again? What can we do individually to address those issues? What can we do collectively? I think that's why we're here today.
Okay. All right. It's very interesting that the panelists, you've come up with statistics, you've come up with numbers, you've come up with also, I would almost want to say, rhetorical questions. The intent behind this day is to establish a dialogue. Now, one thing about dialogues, they could last for 15 minutes, 15 hours, but the most important thing that we're looking at now is what can we do at our level or here at the campus to kind of turn things around. We've had 50 years, and from what I'm picking up from you guys is that as things change, they actually remain the same. And if that's the case, can we now talk about what can we do, the students that are sitting out here, the faculty that's sitting out here, some of the community leaders that are sitting out here, what do you think we can do to keep this dialogue going, but not only keep it going, but lead to some form of action? So I'm going to let you guys, for the next 10 minutes, talk amongst yourselves to the audience and let them know what you see as the possible thing that we can do. You know, Dr. King did his speech. Now you have the chance to do yours. Who would like to start off?
Let me just comment firstly. I think, first of all, to discuss race in a real way takes an enormous amount of courage.
Yes.
Okay? We have to be real. We have to be able to understand what role, and I'm not distinguishing people of African descent from people who consider or identify as white, but we all have to kind of look and think very deeply about this. I know in forums that I've been involved with, when the issue of race would come up, it's so much easier to avoid it. I mean, I've seen what I would consider good relationships fall apart when this issue got too sensitive. So I think it's going to take courage, and it's going to take looking. You know, one of the things that's pretty real is that, in my view, there's only one race, and that's the human race, okay? There's no scientific evidence to say anything other. So it's contrived in a way, all right? And the more we can get to the reality that we're all one people, all right? We may look different because we were born in different places and, you know, we have different cultures, et cetera, et cetera. But the more we move towards the reality that we're all one, and, you know, there's an African proverb that goes like, I am because you are, and because you are, therefore I am, which speaks to the interdependence of people. And I think when we start to have a perspective like that, it makes it a little bit easier. You know, we're connected.
I think also, I certainly agree with that. And continuing the dialogue and coming off the definition of race, I think we have to understand what racism is, and most of us don't understand it. Even the learned class don't, and when they do, they don't recognize it, what it is. And so I think that, I mean, we have psychologists and a philosopher here, so I'm sure I'd like to hear them kind of go another round on it. But what my journalist view would be this, is that, and then I'll say what I think your younger generation can do. We interviewed one of the most knowledgeable modern presidents on the issue of race and racism was Bill Clinton. And we interviewed him when he was a president. We, a group of journalists, took a group of journalists in to interview him right before he gave his speech on racism in San Diego back in 1997, I think it was. And so we interviewed him on the eve of that. And I asked him what his definition of race was. I told him to give me 3 definitions of race, and he did, pretty much along the lines of what you said during your opening remarks in terms of what the words. But then I said to him, I said, Mr. President, I'm from New York, and everyone admits that racism exists, but they don't know any. The only racists in New York, I told him, are Jesse Jackson, Leonard Jeffries, Farrakhan, Al Sharpton, or certain black Newsday columnists, and now I think we could add Mr. de Blasio. These are the only racists we know. I said, Mr. President, Bill Clinton, could you name me one single white racist? Now, I took David Duke and Furman off the table. This is right after the O.J. case, so I took Furman. I said, other than Furman and David Duke, I'm not going to give you those. Could you name me one? He didn't. You see, the problem, that's one of the problems. Now, subsequently, I went to Harvard, and I was speaking on a panel, and I gave the same anecdote. And one of the students said, I know one, my parents. Now, we're getting there. Now we're getting there. You see, and when I said earlier about the baby boomer generation, one of the things that you can do is that make sure that on the issue of race relations and openness that you not grow into your parents. That's one of the things you do. You're different from them now. You rebel against them. I know in ways, you know like to embarrass them by bringing home a black date. I know how it works. Yeah, let mom react to this. But I'm talking about, I don't mean dating them necessarily. I'm just talking about getting the view. And I said earlier that Newsday had hit on what racism was. There are 5 questions that pollsters ask to get at what racism is. And in that poll in 1990, they asked white Long Islanders these 5 questions. And if you got 2 out of the 5, then you were considered by those polling. This is Gallup, by the way, who did the poll for Newsday. These questions are, are blacks not as smart as whites? That's one question, yes or no. Another one is, do blacks have a different value? Yes or no. Are blacks more violent than white? Yes or no. Do blacks not work as hard as whites? Yes or no. And the control question was, do you think blacks are better athletes? Now, if you got 2 of those wrong, if you got 2 of those yes, then it was judged by the pollsters that this was an indication and a measurement of racism by your own admission. On Long Island, among whites, and Newsday were embarrassed by this, 70% of white Long Islanders, by these standards, were judged racist. 70%. And these are my generation. These are baby boomers. So you got to get out of that habit.
Wow. Okay, before you start, for those of you who are planning on asking questions, I would recommend at this point, if you want to start making your way either aisle 1 or aisle 2 towards the mic, so we could transition into that quite smoothly. So, and the people with questions start coming forward, so then we'll know exactly which direction to go. Okay, thank you. All right.
Thanks. You know, a large part of criminal justice instruction is ethics. This bringing up the subject of that ethics. I don't think you could teach ethics, right? Introduce it and hope people follow what they're supposed to do. And one of the quotes we use often in that area is often, we say often the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. And that proves true in this arena as well. The question was asked earlier: who benefits from racism? Well, you know, if we're looking for an overt, outlandish example of racism, we're looking for someone spewing epithets and hateful language, you're probably not going to see it. But what we see are those everyday practices that have an effect, that keep this situation and perpetuate this situation. We're familiar with terms like bank redlining. We're familiar with racial profiling. In those incidents, that's what keeps it going. We need to stop ourselves, stop others when they engage in those practices which perpetuate that feeling and those myths and that climate. How many times do we go into a store and as black men and get followed by security? It happens all the time. And let me share with you a little trick that I've come up with. When you find yourself being shadowed by store security, go over and stand next to them. And they can't stay there forever, so they're going to move. And then you move along with them. It's an interesting little game.
Okay, Mark?
I got about 50 things I'd like to say. One just term and concept to put on the table that I think dovetails with some of the things Les was saying is the concept developed by the sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, colorblind racism. Right? Thinking that because there has been so much overt progress with respect to changes in laws and explicitly state-sanctioned racism, that we can assume that that history of racism doesn't inform our thinking today. So we're just going to look at the world in this magical colorblind way. The way in which that approach actually hides and discourages the kind of honest conversation about race that you were talking about. And you're absolutely right about that discomfort factor. Professor Daniels has worked with the philosophy club and my classes, and you can just see by the body language how much resistance there is to talking about these things and thinking about these things honestly. I want to add another book recommendation. The historian Khalil Muhammad, fantastic book, came out a couple of years ago, The Condemnation of Blackness, which details the history that I was referencing before, starting right after the emancipation of the slaves, how an explicit effort to criminalize ordinary black behavior took off in the South, spread through the North, and leads us to this situation, whether we're just ordinary folks, whether we're a group of police officers confronting an unarmed black man, leads us to the situation where we have this perceptual, pre-conscious, immediate, reactive association between blackness and criminality. It's an excellent resource to start doing that kind of unpacking. And when we see those impulses in ourselves, it gives us a magnifying glass to start looking at them and examining them and hopefully combating them.
All right. The one excellent situation dealing with a discussion like this is not only hearing from my experts, but to also have the experts sitting out in the seats there sharing their thoughts and their ideas. What I would like each person to do as you approach the microphone, give us your name and please pose your question. Remember, try to give us a question, not a comment, because comments could go for 2 hours. So please give us a question. All right, first person up.
Hi, my name is Jamal. My question is, do you think America as a whole remorse more on past tragic events such as the Holocaust, the World War, the Vietnam War, and 9/11 rather than slavery? And do you think such societal injustice is the core or missing catalyst of bridging that gap?
Well,
just be clear. Your question is there more focus on these other events or situations, circumstances that have happened?
Yes.
As opposed to slavery?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think that I would guess that slavery is something that primarily people of color think about, or particular people of African ancestry think about. I don't know how much others do. I would guess that it's probably a much less percentage that this becomes some conscious thing with other than people of color. So, and again, one of the things, and I'll just say this again, is that we're all kind of here together, and it behooves us to be sensitive and responsive to each other. So if we don't consider these things, it continues to be a wedge in terms of race relations or, relations between people.
As moderator, I'm going to just give my side also. As a student about your age, and I remember sitting in a sociology class when we were talking about basically race, but however, when I mentioned that we don't talk enough about the cruelty and the healing from enslavement, my professor and my fellow student says, "Oh, but that's the past. Get over it." So it seems like sometimes when you want to have a discussion about it, you almost feel like you're going against the tide. So those discussions do not come up, and people will say, get over it. It's too long ago. But yet the ills of it, the effects of it, are still dealing, in us today. But that's a very good question. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay. Oh, okay. Yes, you can. Go ahead.
Just add one word to that. One thing that I was trying to lead toward with my opening remarks was a call to some kind of self-examination, self-reflection, and just thinking about the examples you throw out, isn't it much easier to think about those other tragedies than the history of slavery? 9/11, well, we were victimized. Holocaust, that was the other, that was them. Slavery is part of our own history, so it's us, right? Much more difficult to have that kind of honesty and self-honesty. So whether quantitatively, statistically, there's more or less attention to one tragedy over the other, I just think that psychological barrier of being of the challenge of being fully transparent to ourselves, I think that plays a role in what you're getting at.
No, a twist on that question that I think is important, where the young brother is right there, and that is that I think that African Americans of my generation did not come to terms with slavery themselves, and therein was a big problem. We can talk about that during the break. That is a huge problem. Until we connect with Africa and with our history of slavery, I think it's one of the things that kind of hangs us up and hung up a whole generation. That's a huge problem.
That's it. Okay. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Doreen, and I have a question. Do you think the stop and frisk is connected to the way people have been programmed to think with racism and how things used to be back in the day? Or do you think it's just something that has been brought up to keep racism hidden but not spoken about?
I think that stop and frisk is part of a larger American reality that extends back to slavery and post-civil rights days. I think that oppression of one people by another, there is an art form. And one of the art forms is the suppression of that people. If you look at the Spartans and the Helots, same thing. You look at the Kurds in Turkey, you look at any oppressed people, you will find these same kinds of mechanisms operating against them. This is not random. It is done, this stop and frisk is done in the name and with the tacit approval of the majority of the dominant society. They know this is doing, and they approve of it. They approved of what Zimmerman did. I talked to my son who lives in Orlando and read all of those papers in the Sanford Herald, as well as the Orlando Sentinel. In fact, I know the editor who ran those stories in the Orlando Sentinel. This broke down on racial lines. White Americans in Florida approved of what Zimmerman did, okay? And blacks were against it. In the Getz case, white New Yorkers approved of Getz. He was a hero of theirs. So we should be clear about this. This is a political weapon in the hand of the dominant society. It is not happenstance. It is not random. It is an art form device that is used to keep black folks in check. And it is not simply the cop doing his job, as it were. It is a society. And when Bloomberg said what he did, I mean, it's horrendous, but it is in keeping with what that device is.
Okay, very good.
Just to add to that, there's nothing hidden about stop and frisk. It's quite out in the open with people doing it. And that's one of the tragedies, and Mr. Payne just related that to us. It also, a lot of commentators related to the old slave patrols shortly after, in our history, right? Whites were taught and even obligated to return runaway slaves to their owners, and this has a curious connection or at least a visual remind of that. Stop and frisk was a very narrow, intended to be a very narrow allowance for a police officer to protect him or herself. It wasn't intended to be a program. And to see that a mayor of a major city can call this a program when he says and tells the police officers and directs them to stop people based on their race, thank goodness we saw a federal court disallow that recently. So, yeah, hopefully this is the end of that kind of action, though the mentality and the thought that, yes, that there is a superior race that should keep another people in check, well, that will go on, yeah.
And this contributes to the divisions between people again, okay? It used to be that only criminals were afraid of the police. Now we have young black men and maybe others who are fearful of the police. I've heard many people say, you know, if something happens, the last person I'm gonna call is a cop because I may wind up getting locked up or getting hurt. So again, you know, we need to be working towards trying to come together. It continues this divisiveness that is counterproductive from my perspective.
Okay. Let's go over to the stage right.
Hello, my name is Catherine. I just want to say, like, as a people, we do evolve biologically, mentally, and physically. So do you believe that the post-slavery, and I want to use this term loosely, the post-master mentality, like, evolved with us as a people and as, like, as a nation?
A postmaster, you mean, I just want to be clear with what you're referring to. That there's somebody dominant over somebody else?
Right, like the master role of over the slaves.
Yeah.
I think what she's alluding to is what today we would use that term to be would be considered white privilege.
When you use the word evolve, let me just say this: the impulse to objectify the other is perhaps a pretty deep impulse in human nature, and race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, these are things that are fairly obviously observable, so it gives us an easy, convenient way to project our anxieties, project our fears upon the other, whoever is in that other category. So when you use the word evolve, I'm not sure if you're saying that this is something biologically within the human being, or using it more culturally. But I think that sense of using the other, however that other is defined, as a way of identifying ourselves, and usually as a way of trying to identify ourselves as the superior to the other, that has a great deal of power in not just our history, but I think human history.
Hi, my name's Jeffrey Clinton. This question is more directed at Mr. Payne. I'm gonna have to say, no offense, I'm gonna have to say I empathize with Mr. Williams about like the pessimism as far as institutional power and blackness. I feel that like Obama, what exactly do you think he represents, and being that these problems still like occur, what do you think he's doing to stop it, and do you think he can stop it?
Stop what? I'm sorry. Stop.
As far as, or try to like help the problems that are occurring in the African American community.
Crimes?
Yeah, no, just like, crimes,
Well, okay, I get it.
Sorry.
Well, President Obama's election was historic in every sense. I think psychologically it had a huge impact on African Americans. And on white Americans too, from younger ones in particular. All right, it was a historical moment. My sister, who is 50 years old, went to the White House for the first time on a tour because she didn't say this, but obviously she did not feel a part of this republic until then. So it was a huge. Dr. King, for instance, we mentioned his march. He talked about fairness. I mean, I think this represented at least a political maturing of the country to a point where an African American could be duly elected. Now, in terms of crime, and the media perhaps have some responsibility for this, but he has done an incredible lot. I'll give you an example. We talked to President Clinton and Senator Clinton when she was running about, give you but one example. I give you dozens, but I give you one on crime. President Clinton, whom Black Americans embraced, who, in my view, had one of the worst records on civil rights ever. But at any rate, he signed the Omnibus Crime Bill in 1995. And in that omnibus crime bill, it certified yet again that there would be a 100-to-1 ratio for the punishment of crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine. Okay, now, to be very clear on this, one of the perceptions was that African Americans tend to use crack cocaine and whites tended to stick to powdered cocaine in Wall Street as well as Hollywood, as well as maybe in this order, no, as well as on Long Island. All right, and therefore, it was Clinton signed the bill saying there would be, in other words, you would have to be caught with 100 times more cocaine to get to punishment, you know, and it was a mandatory 5-year sentence as well. And I asked Clinton about this, and he said, well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it. All right, now, it is like, and I told him, it is like if you, during Prohibition, if alcohol was outlawed, and you were to find that African Americans drank Coke 45 and whites drank Coors, you would make the punishment for Coke 45 100 times greater than Coors. That's how insidious that law was. Which president? Now, we asked Obama, Senator Obama, about it when he was running, and he said he figured it should be zero. It should be equal. But what he did, if you read the Fair Sentencing Act, one of the first things he signed when he became president, Obama, read the Fair Sentencing Act. He closed it from 100-to-1, not 100%, to roughly 18-to-1, 82%. He closed the gap. He got rid of the 5-year mandatory sentencing, which had put thousands of African Americans in prison. He signed that. That's a huge substantive thing that was done. And I could go down the list. I mean, HBCUs, historically black colleges. I mean, people don't know. I mean, I don't know what papers people read or what records you read. And I think, and I'm not to be offensive, but, I think that he has made a huge difference psychologically. I'm not the psychiatrist in the group, but I am the journalist, and I know journalistically I could tick off dozens of differences that he's made.
Okay, all right.
I think we need to...
Okay, real quick.
About that, though. We need to see more about it. Because I think one of the failures is we don't get to see that. If I'm kind of hearing what you're saying, that these things may be, but if we don't know they are, we don't know. Okay? And we have a perception that may be very cynical and negative.
The media deserves some blame for that.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
not all, but some.
Yeah, no, and I think that needs to be, and there are reasons why that doesn't get out.
Okay, we have to move on. Round of applause. Come on. All right. Now you know what? See, this man he's wearing my motto. Just do it.
My name's Jordan, and Dr. Griffith. I was wondering when you said, "What is it like to be white?" I kind of took a little offense to that because I feel that there's more of an allowance for colored people to be more racist and not really care about what they say towards white people, but white people need to be making sure that they can't say anything wrong. And I want to know, why is that?
That's, I think, a great question. First, let me just say the reason I raise that is because psychologically, both consciously and unconsciously, people of color have to be mindful of their color, okay? People who consider themselves white typically do not. At least that's my understanding, okay? To answer that second part of your question, why do people who consider themselves white have to be careful about what they say? Well, roughly, is that, they don't have the liberty to say certain things where...
Yeah, because I feel that...
I don't know how true that is, number one. I mean, I've heard a lot of things, okay, from people who consider themselves white that were offensive and racial. I think, it's... I'm not sure. I'm not really sure about that. I think, one of the constrictions of society is that we're supposed to be politically correct, all right? Sometimes that means often it means we're not honest. So I think, to be honest, without being offensive, would be something that would be important. To be able to say what you feel and what you think without it intending to be offensive, whether or not how it impacts the other person, doesn't matter.
Okay. All right. Good question.
If I can jump in as the representative of the white race on the panel.
You weren't supposed to know that.
You didn't see me as white? You thought I was black?
I think we make a category mistake, and again, it dovetails with the term I used before of colorblind racism. To think that we can talk about these issues in a kind of purely neutral, ahistorical way. The concepts of race, of whiteness and blackness are not biological concepts, they are not natural concepts, they are constructions. And those constructions within our society have a very clear history in which white and black are not neutral terms. There is a clear power differential between those two terms. So one of the, I think your point dovetails with some of the blowback that we hear concerning affirmative action. Well, how can we have an affirmative action program if we're supposed to be race neutral? If race isn't supposed to matter, why should we be taking it into account? Well, again, think about it from the historical standpoint. It's not just a matter of race as this neutral, arbitrary property. Not supposed to count, shouldn't count in our decisions about who we hire and who gets admitted to universities. You need to look at how that concept has functioned historically in identifying someone as white versus identifying someone as black. It's not just it's not just a biological identification. There's this whole tortured history behind it. And I think that's part of the sensitivity that we need to bring to these kinds of discussions.
Okay. He's going to go, and you have the last word.
Cody, and just to respond to what Jamal said, in terms of, I just feel like I'm so close to the microphone. In the response to what Jamal said, in terms of the history of mankind, I feel like we have not just necessarily, any single race in particular, but we as a whole kind of have a narrow view of history in terms of, what we want to see and who we want to hold accountable. And I feel like also mentioning history, I feel like if we were to take it all in, we wouldn't make the same mistakes that we've made in the past. Because what are we still doing? We're still in Syria, we're still in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to get into that. But my question is, do you think that the judging of others is a necessary evil? Like, in terms of, for your own protection's sake? Because I've heard psychologists say that.
Well, I think that, I'll stay away from the psychologist thing, but the journalist's answer is that you judge, in other words, take stop and frisk. It is perfectly fine to be wary of what you consider to be criminal types. I am, aware of criminal type. But my wariness about criminal types does not include is not limited to black folks. You see, but if you say that blacks are therefore criminal types, then that's too broad a judgment. That's the stereotype. You see, so what I look for, certain movements a person may make, we know is a certain diverting of their eyes. I know, you know the signals. There's a certain way of people approach you, a certain way they look. That's okay. But what the police are doing is racial profiling and not criminal profiling, as but one limited example. And so I think we make judgments all the time. Nothing wrong with making a judgment, but it is wrong to make a judgment based on the whole race of people, attributing the kind of characteristics in that question, that they are lazy, that they have a different value system, they don't work as hard, this whole group.
It's just a white brush.
Yeah.
One of the things that came out in the presentation of statistics and the studies of stop and frisk in the New York City cases in the federal courts, they found that officers were successful, if you will, at picking out criminals when the subject of the stop and frisk observation was white. And the reason for that, the experts say, not just me, the reason was that the police officers were employing more well-grounded observations in those situations, not using race as the criteria. What they were using were what police officers should be using exclusively, and that is, what is it that the subject is doing that tends to show some criminality and not race. And the statistics bear that out. The dismal results of stop and frisk of people in general, including people of color in New York City and Latinos, was that they were coming up with criminals, and guns were the confiscation or discovery of guns was often the object of stop and frisk, in less than 1% of the cases. So it wasn't successful. It wasn't it didn't get the desired results, and it inflamed the community, and it was an affront to all of us, black, white, in general. In New York City, overwhelmingly, New York City residents of all backgrounds don't like stop and frisk and not in favor of it.
Okay.
It's not the law. Terry versus Ohio says that if an officer has reasonable suspicion, he can stop someone. In the Terry versus Ohio case, reasonable suspicion. Race is, the fact that he's black cannot be construed to be a reasonable suspicion. But to buttress his case in terms of what they found is that the differences were astounding. The Attorney General, the New York State Attorney General, did a study of the stop and frisk. The New York Attorney General was Spitzer, by the way, when he was Attorney General, before he became governor, before he became disgraced, before he ran for mayor. But it was Spitzer. He was a pretty good Attorney General. And you can read his thick report. But he looked at stop and frisk, or his office looked at stop and frisk when he was the New York State Attorney General. And what they found, interestingly, and you go between the thin lines of this, is that they were stopping, God knows, 10 times as many African Americans to get 8 times as many arrests than whites. But the statistics on whites is that when they stopped whites, this report says 12.8% of these stops led to arrests. That is not to say that it should have led to arrest. They may have caught him with pot and let him go. They may have caught him with a gun and said, go home. You're a priest. You're my priest or rabbi, or the rabbi with crack now. You can go home. It's all right. But 12% of them led to arrests. Of the African Americans they stopped in New York on the stop and frisk, 0.5 led to arrests. The difference between 0.5 and 12.5, do the math. That's the difference between not abiding by Terry versus Ohio.
Wow. Okay.
I think the other part of, if I heard you correctly, and this is something we really have not addressed, I don't think, has to do with the roots of racism and the benefits of racism. Brother Daniels alluded to white privilege. I would go even further to say white survival. And we can get into that maybe in the luncheon discussion a little bit more.
Over the lunch.
But that we have to look at the underpinnings. What is race all about? Where did this come from? As I asked the question before, what did black people ever do to warrant the treatment that they get from white people? Some black people would say, we used to, back in the days, we used to take care of the white people. We used to take care of their babies.
So, last question.
Okay. Professor Griffith, you asked before what it's like being white, and I'd like to tell you, because I am white, and I've been white all my life. I have a mother, a father, they're separated, I have a little sister, I have a dog, and I have a cat. I go to school, and I work. I think it's a pretty normal life. Now, where I work, I'm a waitress, and I'm a waitress at Chili's, and I have served everyone. I've served black, whites, Latinos, Middle Eastern, probably Buddhists, Jehovah's Witnesses, you name it, I've served them. But one thing that I have noticed is that when I go up and I greet a table, the faces sometimes change instantly when they see yet another white server. And I feel like there's almost like a counter-racism. And let me tell you a little story.
Okay.
That has happened several times.
Yeah.
But this one in particular, I had this table. It was a mother, a father, 2 toddlers, and a little baby. And they were black. And I greet them like, hey, how's everything going? I take care of them. I do everything fine. But the whole time, they're just so angry, so upset. And I feel terrible because I feel like my job is to make your experience good. And I don't understand what's going on, and I'm in the kitchen, and I'm so upset, and I can't figure out what's wrong. At the time, we had a manager in training, and his name was Denny. Denny was a black male, and Denny's like, what's wrong? And I say, you know what, I don't know what's wrong with this table. Like, can you please talk to them, make sure everything's all right? Denny walks up to this table, everything was fine.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a counter-racism?
Well, I don't know if I would call it that. I would probably call it displacement. See, the racial experiences emotionally have to go somewhere. Where do they reside inside of one? Okay? There was an incident just last weekend, right? Down at Union Square when this guy punched out the guy, and his first, what they said on the media was he was going to punch the first white guy he saw. Where did that come from? Okay? It's probably in part accumulation of anger and rage that has nothing to do with you. Just like much of racism does not have to do with my brother and I here, because if we know each other, we'll probably be cool. Okay? We don't know each other. All right? So I might treat him a certain way, he may treat me a certain way. But once we know each other, we're okay. So what the point I'm making, it's displacement. Okay? A lot of times, that rage and anger has to go somewhere. And unfortunately, the position you had as a server, you were a target that, you know the story about displacement, right? Displacement is like the worker gets chewed out by the boss, right? The worker cannot really address the boss because he might lose his job. He comes home, he takes it out on his wife. His wife can't deal with it with him, she takes it out on the kid, and the kid kicks the dog, you know. So that's you, unfortunately, were in there somewhere, you know. So I don't know if I'd call it reverse racism. I mean, we need to own it, us people who consider ourselves African ancestry, and, you know, try to deal with our emotional reactions to whoever they should be reacted to, not someone else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Branching off of that, what do you think it's like to be white? And also, do you think that a lot of black people, Latino people, what have you, think that most white people are racist and therefore there's this animosity between the two? Because some people are a certain way and there's terrible people of all races. And
well,
I feel like
yeah, I mean, there's a wide range and variation of folk. I mean, I think what was alluded to before were what we call microaggressions. These subtle, non-intentional slights, insults, you know, being followed in the store, okay? I had one of my colleagues or a friend of mine who was the chair of a department in a medical facility, had just gotten to, he just got the position, and they actually had a big reception for him. And he got there early, and he happened to have a suit on, but he took his jacket off. And while he was there, the housekeeping crew were putting things together. And one of the supervisors in the housekeeping crew went over to him and said, "What are you doing sitting down?" Now, he was the chair that they didn't even know, the chair of the department. I'm saying that there are lots of microaggressions. There are lots of things that are not intended to be slights, but they're systematized in this nation. And people experience it. People of color experience it. So, you know, we need to look at that. We need to call that out. As I said before, you know, in my view, there's only one race, and that's the human race. And the sooner we start to relate to one another as in a human being way, the better off we'll all be. Where did our moderator go? He went to lunch? He left us and went to lunch. Okay.
You know, just to follow up on that, if we have a moment, I would be careful about really taking that single incident or in even instances from that setting and reading into it perhaps is what's going on. And just as it was suggested, often it's the institution, it's the system that people are reacting to, not necessarily an individual. The fact that people have gone through this incident or this process time and time again is what's frustrating, and not so much about the individual. And again, we have created practices and systems that sort of support these flights. Yeah. And one way to address it, I was asking, what could we do? One way to address it is ask, right? Say, pardon me, excuse me, is something wrong? Or whatever. Yeah. And even the communication is definitely a key that we
and
we
even
haven't mentioned.
More profound, not to cut you off, is, you know, what people of color do in communities of color. I mean, we have like black on black crime, so-called, whatever, okay? This is where some of that anger and rage gets also displaced, okay? I mean, in horrific ways. So, I mean, we need to address that too, and I think that's also something that is an outgrowth of, you know, of what we're talking about on race. That you know, we've got a lot of homework to do. As I said, the village is fragmented. We have to try to pull that village back together so we start to see ourselves and deal with ourselves in a more human way.
Okay, that's the last word. Let's give our panelists a applause. Also, just to let you know, when I first started working at the college, my mentor said certain things you don't talk about with students or fellow faculty people. You don't talk about politics, religion, sex, and race. Later on, it changed a little bit. They said you don't talk about politics, sex, religion, and OJ. So that's it. So at this point, two things. If you think that we need to do a little bit more or a lot more, we're going to establish a group called the Prejudice Reduction Team, where we'll get a group of students that will be trained in terms of sensitivity, but also how to address issues. And maybe from a small committee, we could do some great things here on this campus. So if you have any questions about that, my office is Captree Commons, room 110, and I want to thank you for coming. And remember, this is a springboard. This is not the destination, it's a springboard. Let's see how we can really change ourselves plus change the world. Thank you for coming.